Hi everyone, my name is Michael Cook. I'm an AI and games researcher at Falmouth University with the MetaMakers Institute, and this is the presentation for a paper I wrote submitted to the Experimental AI and Games workshop at AID 2017. It's about my previous work in a field called automated game design and how my thinking has changed over the years, and some new work I've been doing on a piece of software called ANGELINA and this new idea that I'm putting forward called continuous automated game design. The talk begins by going over some of my previous work, just to give you an idea about the kinds of things I was thinking about and my motivations for changing how I worked, basically. So back in 2010, I was a PhD student, just starting off my career, and my supervisor gave me this question to work with, and it really captured my imagination. I was really excited to work on it, and it was, can a computer automatically design games? And we didn't really know where that would lead, or even how to work on it particularly. But this was where I started. And it was in a field called computational creativity, which is a subfield of AI concerned with building AI that can do creative stuff, things like composing music or painting pictures or designing video games. And 5 years later, I published my thesis. Basically, yes, you can get a computer to automatically design games. They may not be very good, but it is possible, which is not that surprising. But the interesting stuff was where we went on the way there. So I built a piece of software called ANGELINA, and that was the name for my automated game designer. And really, it was the name of several different pieces of software that changed over the years and had some version numbers attached later on as an afterthought. But to give you a rough idea of some of the versions, the first one looked like this, and it made HTML5 games. They were very simple, as you can see, just circles moving around a screen. They didn't have any visual theme. They had like a name, but it was randomly generated. And generally kind of arcade-style mechanics. ANGELINA would pick from a catalog of mechanics that I gave it. And really, this was a technical piece of work. It was about understanding evolution, understanding how to design a game all at once. I had this idea that everything should be done together. Everything, like the level design and the rule design, should be done at the same time so they can influence one another. And that sort of fairly innocuous decision ended up defining the entire of my PhD. And actually, this paper that I'm presenting today is sort of me going against that fundamental assumption I made when I knew nothing about what I was about to do 5 years before I finished my PhD. After that, I made a couple of different versions. They worked in Flash. They built Metroidvania games, which in this case were kind of like platformers where progress is gated by certain abilities that you have. But most importantly, we also introduced theming here. So you'll see as the GIF plays, jumping around and pictures are appearing of politicians, or sound effects will be playing if you could hear them, but you can't. And this was the beginning of ANGELINA actually working creatively. So it did things like discuss its influences, use real-world ideas, find data on the web about real-world events. And then from there, we kind of moved into this thing which, like, ANGELINA 4 doesn't really exist, but there is this set of projects that never got implemented inside ANGELINA that were kind of experimental ideas that I really liked, and they're worth fitting in here for the narrative so that you can kind of see where I ended up. Because ANGELINA 3, where it was reading newspaper articles and putting in pictures of people and stuff, that was sort of one branch of ANGELINA and one branch of my thinking that was primarily focused on the artistic and creative side of automated game design, I guess. But these other projects I had going on, which were more interested in highly like technical problems or very detail-oriented problems. So Mechanic Miner was a project where ANGELINA, if I call it that, I might as well, was actually able to edit and read and execute individual lines of code in the game engine in order to invent new mechanics. So it would fiddle around with the game code to try and find things that gave the players new abilities. And it worked really well, but it was very hard to integrate into ANGELINA itself. It took a long time to work. It didn't really make sense in the context of designing a game, and so it never really went anywhere, even though it's probably my favorite piece of work that I did. After that, the final major version of ANGELINA I did in my PhD was ANGELINA version 5. It's the one most people have heard of. And if Mechanic Miner is like the second branch, the technical branch of ANGELINA, this one went back to the first one. It went back to the creative branch, the artistics one, the kind of social branch. and it really tried to push the culture of game development into Angelina. So it was less focused on whether these games were good or not, because by that point it was pretty obvious that the games weren't going to be good. And instead, the question was, what do game developers actually do? Like, besides just make games, what do? They take screenshots of their work and they share it on Twitter and they show their game to people and they play other people's games. There were all of these things that game developers did besides developing games that I wanted to look at. And one of those things was entering game jams. So Angelina entered a game jam. That was a big deal. Lots of people wrote about it. That was exciting. And then I wrote my PhD up. So to give you, it's not really important to know the gritty details of Angelina, but roughly, here's what Angelina looked like. And all these versions had this same kind of structure in common. There would be this initial phase where it gathered information that it needed to design a game. So this might be for the game jam, it might be looking up the game jam theme and understanding what it meant. For the newspaper article inspired platformers, it would be like reading the news, looking up images on Google, that kind of thing. And once it had prepared that, it would configure itself, set all of its parameters, and then it would start actually designing. As I mentioned before, the way this worked was there would be several different design modules inside Angelina, but they would all work simultaneously. So the level designer would constantly be designing levels even before the rule set was made. And all the time they would be giving their results to each other and sharing them and looking at them as part of something called a co-evolutionary system. So when the level designer wanted to know if it had had a good idea for a level, it would ask the rule set designer for the best rule set and use that to evaluate the level. And the idea behind the big idea that I had was that this would mean that if the level designer came up with a great idea, then it could influence the other modules, and vice versa. Like any element could influence any other element. And on paper, that's a great idea. In practice, it was all right. It was fine. And then afterwards, we would have this post-design phase, and this was not, so there was some very important stuff, like in some versions of Angelina, it had to compile the final version. Obviously, that's really important. A lot of the stuff that happened in this phase was only really important if you were interested in computational creativity. So this is things like writing commentary, justifying decisions, explaining why the game has a picture of Obama in it, or explaining why it interpreted the game jam theme in this way. So this is creative stuff that's done after the fact, and it's kind of the only trace of Angelina that is actually left once a game is made. Other than the game, the post-design stuff is the only evidence that an AI was ever involved in this process. And then you release the game. So just a couple of slides on some of the tensions here and the kind of, not so much issues, but like things to think about. One of the tensions was, and I kind of mentioned this with Mechanic Minor, but one of the tensions was not really knowing how to structure Angelina as it went on and more got added to it. So for instance, when you're working at a high level of abstraction and you're thinking about the general theme of the game, it's very easy to work creatively and not worry about the technical gory details, and you can do interesting work with theme. But then you're sacrificing a focus on low-level detail and technical stuff because you're spending a lot of time doing this, and this is kind of the focus of the project. And the other problem was some of these tasks just didn't make sense in the context of designing a game. So, okay, when you're designing levels, maybe that makes sense to be doing that for the bulk of the game development process. But for other things, like getting inspiration, that had to be put in this thing called a pre-design phase, which didn't really make much sense. Like, I understood that it had to be there, but the whole principle of my idea was that everything should happen simultaneously, right? So there was always this problem of, this thing actually needs to happen before I even start designing, or this thing needs to happen after I finish designing. Or with Mechanic Minor, there was just this question mark of when should this ever happen? You don't normally invent new mechanics just before finishing a game. You do it at the beginning of the game development process. So it was clear that even though there was good intentions behind my desire to have everything happen simultaneously, there were issues in the structure. It didn't really work properly. The other thing is, if creativity is important to you, and it is very important to me, then there's a recurring problem of no one really liked the fact that Angelina was a piece of software. I decided when it turned on, I decided when it turned off, I pressed go, and then a game came out. And there was no way to actually connect with Angelina as a concept, as an entity. You could only see shadows of it cast by like the games that it produced. No one really had an idea of what Angelina liked or what Angelina thought was good. You would just see glimpses of it when you played a game that it had made. And that affected the understanding of the software. And in some ways it made it better because people filled in with their imagination. But in other ways it made it worse. It feels like Angelina is an app on my phone that I press a button and it makes a game. But it wasn't supposed to be like that. And there were other cool ideas that I'll mention later that weren't possible because Angelina makes games in like 4 hours. And that's not much time to do a lot of interesting things in. And just as a side note here, and this is not in the paper and it's not particularly important, but I see this a lot in computationally creative systems, is that Angelina is basically a little mirror that is held up to me as I have learned about game development and game design over the years. So in 2010, I knew basically nothing about how to make a game, and as you could see in that previous slide, neither did Angelina. By 2013, 2014, I was entering game jams regularly. I really liked game jams, and I connected with a lot of game developers, and I began to feel part of a community. And so that's what Angelina did as well. And we both made small games and finished them quickly or gave up on them. And now in 2017, I feel differently about game development again. I'm working on a big game, my first kind of commercial big release. I stop and start on things. I learn, I go back and correct my mistakes. And coming back to Angelina after my PhD, I found that I wanted to kind of do that as well. And so that has definitely affected things. And so we come to 2017 and continuous automated game design. And I know that was a lot of minutes of talking, but hopefully it's set you up for what I'm going to talk about now. So what are the principles of continuous AGD? First of all is that you don't press go on these systems. I mean, you can sort of suspend them and put them to sleep to stop your electricity bills from exploding. But the point is there's no button that says make a game. There's a button that says do things. But in general, these systems have no beginning and no end. They move between creative activities and they keep on doing so forever. And this is enabled by the second bit, which is instead of just this single thing that builds a game, there are modules that it can move between as and when it pleases. It can go and do some level design for a bit, and then it can go and do some rule set design or some social interaction or whatever. And also, and this is not necessarily a feature of continuous AGD, but I feel like it's a side effect of how these systems should be built, is that because there is no beginning or end and there's no make a game button, the development process slows down, and games now take maybe days to make or even weeks instead of hours, and there's no guarantee you'll get a game. And that sounds like a bad thing, but it's actually well, it's not necessarily universally good, but it is interesting. So now let me show you the structure of what Angelina looks like today. It has a database of projects, and each one of these represents a game that is being developed. And that includes past versions of the game and information on whether the game has been abandoned or how much progress is being made, maybe that kind of thing. It also has a set of modules expressed as tasks, and these tasks can be things like invent a new rule set, or playtest levels, or design a new level. Those are very basic examples because there aren't many modules in Angelina right now, but you get the idea. They're standalone tasks that can be done in isolation and are not tied to a particular project or aim. And Angelina just moves through, and it will pick a game, and it will look at what tasks are left to do for this game, and then it will pick a task to do and a module, and then it might design levels for a game, and then it puts that game back, and then it goes and picks up another game, and it explores the rule set for it. It sees whether the rule set is feasible, and then it comes back to the game it put down earlier, and it gets it ready to release it online. And each of these stages has side effects. So if you design levels, you're probably going to write those levels back to the database. And if you decide a game isn't very good, you might abandon it. And when you're releasing games, you're going to produce things that go somewhere. Maybe they get uploaded to a website. So each of these modules are progressing the projects, or at least getting information. Like you might characterize progress as just learning that this project is not very good. That's still progress technically. So what are projects actually? They are, like I said, they're a history of a game. So it's not just the game now, but also how the game was before I made it better, maybe. And they're defined as these JSON scripts, and so is the game themselves. And I've got some examples in the paper. I'm not going to go through syntax now. It kind of looks like a little bit puzzle script, a little bit VGDL. It's neither of those things. Not just because I wanted I had sort of certain needs, but also there's some planned features in Angelina later on that required the rules to be very carefully defined. So basically, one of the things I want to do is have Angelina both work with known mechanics and then later on be able to invent them itself. And if it invents a good mechanic, it can add that to the list of known mechanics and use that later without having to think about where it came from. But that's explained a little bit better in the paper. And the way the games work now is that they run like cartridges. So you have this JSON file that describes the game, and that gets plugged into the game engine app. And one of the reasons for doing that is there's nothing clever or AI related about that. It's because for the last 7 years, I found it very difficult to get Angelina to output games. There's always been some horrible export process. And now there's a very easy export process because you have a little console app and you plug in a text file and then the game runs. So that's pretty useful. I also talked about tasks. So tasks are these activities that you're going to do, and most importantly, they are completely isolated. So they have these very clean interfaces that say, if you give me a game and you give me some parameters, I will design a level for it, for instance, and then I will give you the level back and tell you when I'm done. And this is cool because it allows code reuse, obviously, and also makes the system very flexible, and it might make it easier for Angelina to have greater independence in the future because the level design task is very generic. It doesn't require any special understanding. You just know that when you hand off a game to this task, it will give you a level back eventually. And they can be all kinds of things. They can be very technical, like playtesting a level and analyzing how good it is or how well structured it is, for instance. They can be more artistic, like picking music pieces or designing a cover for the game. Or they might even be social. It might be things like tweeting about the game or interpreting feedback from human beings. And the reason why the task system is so good is partly because engineering-wise, this is the cleanest Angelina that I've ever made. Like, it's so easy to add new tasks to, and it's easy to test them as well, which is really great. And it also means that the system is just engineered a little bit better. You can interrupt it during, like, you can turn the system off whenever you want to, and you don't lose anything. The database still exists. Whatever module was currently running obviously has to kill what it's doing, but everything else that it had done is saved. So you have these projects that are half completed, and they remain half completed, and Angelina can... It's not even a special case. It's actually very natural for Angelina to just pick up this project again the next day and complete whatever the next task was on its list. And, you know, I guess some of these are just quality of life changes, but I think they contribute towards being able to, I don't know, for me as a researcher, sometimes having a system that is built better and structured better means that I can do better research because I spend less time fighting against my own system. And, you know, sometimes I'm an advocate for not caring about that stuff, but this time it felt very important to get it right. And so far it has been. Modules are really great. And this has all the other nice side effects of this is not just that it can sort of stop anytime, but also that you can give it a half-finished project or projects made by something else. So I'm hoping it'll be possible to have other systems give games to Angelina or humans give games to Angelina. But that's something for the future. The other big thing is how they affect your kind of mindset. So they emphasize persistence. So because these modules need interfaces to hand off data to them, that means that everything has to be saved. So you have to save the fact that, like, the state of this game or the state of its rule set or what the rule sets used to be like, maybe, in case you want to back up. Or you have to save, like, what your intention was. Because otherwise the module won't be able to access any of that information. And for me, that's something I should be doing anyway because I'm building a creative system and I want it to be perceived as being creative. But just naturally, it kind of forces you to do these things, which means that you have more information held persistently for the system to use to convince people it's creative. It can talk about more stuff because there's more stuff permanently there. And kind of in the past, Angelina would build a game and then the game would leave and Angelina would kind of just die. Like, it just ceases to exist unless it's making a game. Whereas now there's this persistent thing that is Angelina from which games emerge, which is great. The other cool side effect it has is that you by on it sounds like slowing the system down would be a bad thing, but it actually just gives you more room to do all kinds of stuff. Like the system can go away from a project and just wait for 5 days and come back to it later. And it might do that because it's frustrated, because it can't make progress, because like you can imagine that Angelina would make a game and be unable to make it good. And instead of crashing or throwing it away like it would have done before, it just archives it. And a month later, maybe, it invents a new mechanic, and this mechanic fixes that game. And then it goes back and it builds that game and it finishes it. And that's an amazing creative story that it can tell now, because it's not obsessed with, I have been activated and now I have to produce a game before I go to sleep again. All of those things are out of the window. And also we can do weird stuff like playtest with real humans. Like Angelina can send a build out on a Monday and wait for playtest feedback on a Friday, and that's not a big deal because Angelina is not tied to a particular timescale anymore. It's just this persistent thing that is always creating, which is great. And the other cool thing, at least from my perspective, because it's in my living room every day, is that I can watch it do stuff. I can watch it make games. I can watch it test levels. It's running next to me as I record this video. And you can watch it make mistakes. I mean, it's not super interesting, just like watching game development isn't super interesting most of the time. But there are moments of interestingness, and seeing it over a longer time scale is also pretty cool. So briefly, the kinds of things I'm thinking about right now, I've tried to avoid talking just about what's in the paper, so this is more about what I'm doing right now. So I'm trying to work on a notion of progress for Angelina, so it has reasons to ditch stuff or come back to things, and also trying to decide what Angelina should actually frame and talk to people about, because you don't want it to talk about things that are boring. You want it to understand that no one cares that you've reinvented Soccerban or whatever. And there's a lot of really hard future work stuff on the horizon. I've mentioned working with humans. Real world meaning is going to come back, and that's always going to be hard because it always is hard. And I've got some secret things which I'll talk about. I don't quite have them ready to announce yet, but I'll be talking about them on Twitter soon, so stay tuned for that. So just a quick summary. Before, Angelina was entirely contained inside the games as it made them. And the games would be made by Angelina and increased, and then eventually the game would disappear, and Angelina was just this tiny husk left behind. Whereas now, continuous automated game design means that Angelina is a thing in which games exist, and those games are offshoots of a creative process. They aren't the creative process, they are outcomes, they are side effects of a creative process. And that sounds like a small change maybe, but it's actually fundamental and huge. So continuous AGG systems, they don't have a start or an end. They're always working, they're always creating, and occasionally they produce things, but that's not their only purpose. Slowing down creative systems like automated game designers is good. It's not bad. It's actually amazing. Everyone should slow their systems down. It gives you so much more time to think about things. And, not like slowing it down by like an extra hour. I mean, making it take 100 times as long and then think about what you can do with all of that space. It's amazing. And modules are really great. They're great for engineering. They're great for art. And they make you think about a creative system differently, which is fantastic. And Angelina's back, which is great because I really missed it. I haven't worked on it properly for like 2 years. And I'm looking forward to getting emails from my AI again, which is awesome. Thanks very much for watching. Sorry this was a little bit of a freestyle presentation, but I hope you enjoyed it. If you want to ask me stuff, I'm on Twitter at MTRC. I will be blogging about this research at gamesbyangelina.org. And hopefully Angelina will start tweeting again soon, Angelina's Games, so you can follow it there if you want some updates there. Right, thanks very much for listening. Bye.